Thank you everyone for joining. Today's speaker is Dave Lawrence from NCAR, and he's going to tell us about the Land Use Model Intercomparison Project. Go ahead, Dave.
Yep, okay, thanks. Let me know if you have any problems hearing me. So we'll see how this goes. I just told Kate before everyone got on that about an hour ago, my computer's acted up and it wouldn't let me save files, and this whole talk got corrupted. And so I feverishly spent the last hour trying to resurrect it. So I don't 100% know to what state it got to, but we'll hope it's close to what I intended. Okay, so I'm going to talk about LUMIP. Probably most of you have heard of it. LUMIP is one of the sub-MIPs, CMIP, and we are now sort of far enough along that we have quite a few model simulations coming in, and so I can start showing some initial results and plans. But as you see, there's plenty more to do going forward. And I guess I hate to do this, but I'll apologize in advance because I'm going to be bouncing around pretty broadly as I try to get snippets touching on a bunch of different topics related to LUMIP, and hopefully that's not too hard to follow. But okay, so start off with just some motivation. Most of you are probably aware, but so I don't need to do this, but I'm going to go through briefly. Obviously, we know that regionally, land use and land cover change has likely been as impactful on the surface climate as greenhouse gases. And we also know that land use and land cover change has significant impacts on water. Roughly 70% of the water withdrawals around the planet from rivers and reservoirs are for agriculture, and on energy, associated energy fluxes. And of course, land use and land cover change has a direct impact on carbon emissions. About a third of the total direct historic carbon emissions are coming from land use, about 200 petagrams from land use. And of course, that fraction is going down. Present day, it's closer to 10%, but of a historical record, it's obviously a major contributor. It continues to be. And importantly, it's not just the land cover change, the direct fluxes that impact the carbon cycle. It's also the indirect carbon emissions, such as the loss of the additional sink capacity with that sort of image on the right, doctored image of the breathing of the planet. If you don't have trees around to suck up carbon, then that's going to lead to higher rates of increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. And one of the challenges is that models at this stage really do not agree with either OBS estimates or each other on the sign or the amplitude of the land use land cover change impact. And this is just one example of many. I could show a paper by Lejeune, 2017, where on the right shows observational estimates of the daily maximum temperature change based on paired tower site analysis, showing that in general, when it's deforestation, so it's open land, grasslands, croplands versus forest. They tend to be warmer. Grasslands tend to be warmer than forests in all seasons. And then on the left, you see all the models in CMIP 5 showing a huge range of responses from cooling to warming, not agreeing with each other or the observations. So what's going on? How much faith can we have in those projections of the impacts of land use change on climate with such a large degree of discrepancy? And of course, models don't agree with observation. Sorry, they don't agree with each other in terms of the terrestrial carbon cycle. And this is a paper from Victor Brodkin in 2013 with when they tried to do some land use change experiments for CMIP 5, in this case, just a projection experiment, and maybe focus on the upper right, where you look at the carbon changes due to the RCP 8.5 land use change compared to no change. And what you see is a huge discrepancy across the models, greater than 200 petagrams or up to 200 petagrams difference in the models as well. And to further complicate the issue, that recent research is showing that land management and land cover change may have impacts on surface temperature, for example, that are of similar magnitude. And this is a study by Sebastian Lissert from 2014 now, where they looked again at paired tower sites, but two different sets of paired tower sites. So each dot on here is a paired tower site. And so two sets of paired tower sites. So one would be the blue ones are when there's been a land cover change, so deforestation, for example. And the red sites are where there's been a land management change, so a change in your forestry, for example. And what you see is, if you look across these tower sites, there's definitely many of these paired tower sites that show as strong an impact on surface temperature for just a land management change as there is for a land cover change. And furthermore, basically most of the land across the world is being managed. About 25% of the non-ice land area has undergone land cover change, deforestation, but about additional 50% of non-ice land areas under some form of land management. So almost everywhere around the world where humans could be managing the land, we are. The only places where we're really not are the desert regions, ice sheets, and the high Arctic region. Pretty much everywhere else, we're having a pretty strong impact on land. And lastly, in this motivation section, there's going to be an increase in land use intensification, almost certainly. There's going to be an increase in the need for, due to the increases in global population affluence, an increased demand for land-based food and fiber. And to get to there, that you might be able to expand management into relatively untouched regions, may satisfy part of that demand, but the reality is that most of the good land is already being used, and so land use intensification is going to necessarily have to play a decisive role. And the question is, what impact will that have as you intensify our use of the land on climate and the carbon cycle? And then lastly, there's this expectation that land management is likely going to have to be a mitigation tool to reach 1.5 or 2 degrees C targets, either due to carbon capture and storage through afforestation and reforestation projects, or maybe locally due to albedo management, for example. So all this, indicates we need to do a better job and have a better understanding of the impacts of land use and land cover change on climate and the carbon cycle. I'm just going to give a couple of examples from work that I've been involved in. Recent examples where there's been some work done to show, the impacts of land management in particular on climate. And the first one I'm going to show is a paper that was just published in Nature Communications just a few weeks ago. What this is a couple of simulations, one with irrigation and one without, with CSM. And the top shows the heat extremes, change in heat extremes. So this is just for the hottest day of the year. And the red means hot extremes are getting more likely. The blue means hot extremes are getting less likely. And so when you have an all forcing type simulation with everything but irrigation, we see the anticipated result that due to climate change, CO2, greenhouse gas forcing, there's an increase in heat extremes pretty much everywhere around the world. If you just focus in then on what the impact is from irrigation, you see the opposite effect. Irrigation cools things pretty much everywhere where irrigation is happening, and that cooling can lead to a decrease in the likelihood of a heat extreme, especially because that irrigation is happening usually during the hottest time of the year when crops need the water the most. And then if you combine the two, you can see that it's really the irrigation is having a detectable impact on the overall change in heat extremes. Really around the world, you can look at the Western US, for example, it's less strong when you have all the forces, including irrigation. And in particular, India, where it's completely masked the signal of an increase in heat extremes that you would expect from global warming because of irrigation. The second little example is this impact of cover crops on winter climate, a study that was done by Donica Lombardozzi here at NCAR. And so cover crops are used throughout, by many people in the agriculture world because they have a lot of benefits. One is they reduce soil compaction. They help you manage nitrogen and nutrients. They reduce soil erosion. Usually, if you do it, you get greater water infiltration. You don't lose as much water during the winter season. You can control weeds and increase yields, and potentially also do some carbon sequestration. So it's in general a good thing, but we wanted to ask the question and says, well, is it good when you consider the biophysical impacts? And so what we did is just some simple experiments where we said, let's introduce cover crops during the winter season or early spring season before the crops, the main growing crop grows, and just try a couple of different things. What we see is if you plant a sparse cover crop with a small LEI and an average height, you get some warming across the Midwest. If you plant a cover crop that has a high LEI, that warming is pronounced. And if you do the same thing with a high LEI but a shorter height, that warming is a little bit weaker. And so it's just an indication that, cover crops in general are a good thing, but that due to this albedo impact in snow-covered regions, it can actually have a negative effect, unanticipated or unplanned for negative effect. And this is just a model simulation, so the question is what's happening in the real world. Okay, so that brings me to LUMIT, the goals and activities. And they're fairly standard for what you would expect from a project like LUMIT. The main question is, what are the effects of land use and land use change on climate and the biogeochemical cycling from past into the future? That's pretty much the question that we've been asking anyone who's been involved in land use, land cover change research for the past several decades. And then we wanted to extend it a little bit and also ask the question about what are the impacts of land management on surface fluxes of carbon, water, and energy, and begin to ask at least, are there regional land management strategies with promise to help mitigate against climate change? And these are sort of related to CMIP 6 focus questions and WC grant challenges. And so we've kind of designed LUMIT to help us address a whole bunch of things all at once. Questions like, what is the relative influence of fossil fuel versus land use change, either globally or locally, biogeochemical versus biogeophysical impacts, what is the impact from land cover change versus land management, as I was pointing out earlier, a question about whether or not there's the modulation of the land use impact on climate by the land atmosphere coupling strength, a tie into another myth. And, the topic here is asking a question about, do you get a bigger impact from land use change in places where the land and the atmosphere are tightly coupled? Asking questions about the modulation of global CO2 fertilization by land use and land cover change and direct and indirect carbon responses. And some things that we can't really address that are important, total radiative forcing from land use, land cover change, including all the other trace gases that are emitted due to land use change, scale issues as we can't address in our design, fragmentation of forests. There's lots of other examples of things we can't do. And to do this, we kind of split into three main topics of effort. One is to update our land use data sets and define new model output requests, importantly including subgrid variable output on land use tiles so that we can take advantage of information that has historically been thrown out during the CMIP process on subgrid land information. Two is design and execute a set of experiments that isolate, quantify, and understand land use and land management effects on climate. And then finally, coordinate is what's happening now, coordinate analyses and develop new metrics to assess and quantify and model performance, and also, I should have said, model impact with respect to land use impacts on climate. So that's the goals and activities. I'm not going to go into this at all in detail, but part of the process of LUMIT was to generate a new land use data set called the Land Use Harmonization Data Set version 2. This paper describing this is now in review in GMD. And compared to the data set that we used in CMIP 5, there's a vastly expanded amount of information. It's a higher resolution that extends from 850 all the way up to 2100 for all of the different SSPs, I think 6 to 8 different SSPs. The data has all been revised based on new information. And additionally, there's new management layers. So, for example, historically, changing in time, percent of the cropland that's irrigated, percent of cropland that's flooded. For rice, for example, percent of cropland that's fertilized, and then again, the fertilizer application rates, biofuel crops, crop rotations, and some information about wood harvest. So it's a huge amount more data than there was in the CMIP 5 LUH1 version. And it was designed intentionally so that no model that we're aware of could actually use all of the information. So it's sort of future-proofing the field for a bit. Okay, then I'm going to come to the experimental design. So described in a paper that we published in 2016, it's all the MIPS had to publish their experimental design papers. So experimental designs contains several different kinds of experiments. We're keeping track of clarifications and corrections at our website. There's a tier 1 set of experiments. The first one is an idealized deforestation experiment where we're asking every model to remove 10 million square kilometers of forest over 50 years, like a linearly a linear decrease followed by 30 years of equilibrium. And the idea here is to try to get around, and I'll show a few results from this, to get around the problem we've had in the past where everyone does something different in terms of their representation of land use change, and it's hard to cross-compare across models. The second experiment, the sort of standard obvious one, is historical no land use change, and this allows you to do attribution studies, for example, and try to understand the impact of land use change on climate and biogeochemistry in historical context. And then there's a series of projection period simulations where, in addition to the standard SSP simulations that were required by the scenario MIP, we also have asked for people to produce an alternative simulation where we swapped out the land use in that projection period with an alternative land use. So for example, in SSP 1-2.6, use SSP 1-2.6 land use in an SSP 3-7 simulation. And this is something that a lot of people were sort of calling for after CMIP 5, that this was sort of missing from the CMIP 5 experimental design. It didn't really allow you to assess the impact of alternative trajectories. And then we have a set of tier 2 experiments, additional ensemble members where you have computational time to do it, and then a land management factorial, which I'll describe later, that helps us understand the relative roles of different aspects of land management, how they're contributing individually to the overall total land use and land cover change signal. Okay, so this is a figure showing the holdings that are available on ESGF as of Friday, December 6th. And what you can see is that there are a lot of simulations out there, but there's also a lot of gaps. Modeling centers are slowly but consistently getting simulations up onto the Earth system grid. What my experience is that this is not always fully up to date, and also that there's groups that have runs that are done that haven't been uploaded, that if you ask them that they can do something. In this case, Max Planck is not on here at all, and I know that they've done quite a few simulations. So it's not a totally robust way to figure this out, but you can go to this website and try to keep track, and that's what I've been doing to try to keep track of who's done what. What you see is there's pretty good coverage for Deforest Globe, the idealized deforestation experiment, pretty good coverage for the land use experiment, and pretty good coverage for those projection period experiments. So based on the fact that there's now model output coming, finally, CMIP is here, and we have the opportunity to analyze data. We hosted a workshop, Kate and I organized a workshop in September last year basically on LUMIP to try to advance, first, to have sessions on the state of knowledge of the historic land use and land cover change impacts. So that was kind of a good opportunity for us to take stock about what we know, what we don't know. And then very specifically, we had very targeted breakout meetings to progress reports, and then breakout groups to actually work on the papers that are being worked on for LUMIP to try to advance those papers collectively. And then we also tried to have these connections with multi-sector dynamics and societal impacts people, including people who are interested in water and food security, biodiversity, and other aspects that are sort of, what we're really trying to do with land use and land cover change, or one of the other aspects. And I should just want to note here that one of our biggest funders was the U.S. Department of Energy. So appreciation for that, especially Rena Joseph's program. So at that meeting, we came up with a set of analysis plans, and we're archiving those here or keeping track of them here on this LUMIP webpage. More than 25 papers have been registered for analysis, ranging on topics from designing new metrics to biophysical impacts to biogeochemical impacts, both historic, future simulations, looking at detailed things like irrigation, pretty much anything you can imagine. So if you're interested, please go ahead and go to that webpage, and you can add your name to, if you have a new idea, or you can add your name to some sort of project team if you want to get involved in any one of these projects. And I can't go through anywhere near all of them in this presentation. So now what I'm going to do is kind of, for the remainder of the presentation, go through about 4 or 5 different topics where there's been a little bit of progress on a paper, or there has been significant progress on a paper and show some initial results. So I'm going to kind of go pick one for each one of these different sets of experiments. So I'm going to start off with the idealized deforestation experiment. And so just a reminder, so this experiment is called Deforest Globe. The idea is we remove 10 million square kilometers of forest. Every model removes exactly that amount of forest over 50 years. And to try to concentrate that and so try to make the models agree with each other in terms of where they remove that forest, we asked them to remove the forest from the top 20% of their forested grid cells. So this just shows an example of what the deforestation fraction looks like for two models. And one of the reasons I bring these two models up is that because they're quite different. So CSM, like E3SM, is a model where you tend to, it's focused on prescribing the forest, the plant functional types. So there's sort of a greater degree of control on what's happening. And then the Max-Planck model, JS-Bach, is a DGBM, and so they're prognostically simulating the forest cover. And so they're going to have a forest cover that's not going to match up with observations exactly. But even though these models are simulating fairly different forest covers or a little bit different forest covers, the overall maps look relatively similar. So that was good news that the technique appears to be working, or at least largely working. And so this shows what happens. There's 9 models that have completed this experiment. And what you can see here is that, as maybe not surprising, a pretty strong diversity in the responses. There's pretty broad agreement across most of the models that of a cooling of the near surface temperature across the boreal forest regions due to deforestation associated at least partly with the snow albedo impact, the vegetation albedo interaction. In the tropics, the majority of models, these ones all here, the top 6 and the top 6 panels are all showing warming, but not all models are showing warming. So there is a discrepancy there, as we've seen in the past. So this is maybe not surprising, but here we have, we can sort of throw out a little bit previous problems in previous model comparisons where with sort of realistic simulation of land use change, first of all, the signal was relatively small. And second of all, often the actually simulated land use change was so different, it was hard to cross-compare models. But you can see here that with the areas outlined in black, that the areas where they're being deforested are broadly similar across all the models. So that problem has kind of been removed, but there's still a big discrepancy. And so we're trying to figure that out. Another thing that we're sort of working on, another indication where the models would differ quite a bit, is this concept of the time of signal emergence. And so this is these are just 3 models that can do this where there's more than one ensemble member. So each one of these models has 3 or more ensemble members of this experiment. And what they try to do with that amount of data, they can try to see when can you start separating out a signal from the noise. And so if you look at the 2 models on the right, IPSL and CSM2, they both are sort of showing that somewhere, depending on the strength of the deforestation and where you are in the world, between 10 and 30 years of the deforestation, you can start to see a signal that's popping out above the noise. Whereas the Max-Planck model, interestingly, even though, say, let's look in the tropics, the signal is roughly of the same amplitude in the mean sense. The time of the signal emergence from a statistical standpoint doesn't really show up until quite a bit later, until the model's actually gone past the deforestation period as the equilibrium period. So again, a nice new diagnostic that might be one indication of how the models are differing. Okay, the second sort of set of experiments that I want to talk about is historical land use change experiments. So here I actually don't have any results directly from LUMIT, but I'm going to show a paper that just came out by Liang Chen and Paul Dermeyer that explains how I think we can use these experiments to help us understand why there's so much differences across models. And so this slide here is showing what's known as a space for change or a space for time method to try to come up with an observational estimate of the temperature change that you would get from deforestation. So what they've done here is, if you say on the right here is a MODIS pixel of roughly say 1 degree latitude to longitude. So it's actually not one pixel, it's one region of MODIS, about 1 degree latitude and longitude. And you see the skin temperature that you see from that signal there. Warm is red, blue is cold. And then you can also recover the tree cover fraction. In this case, large tree fraction is red, low tree fraction is blue. If we try to then sort of separate out the places where there's majority trees or majority grasses, you can then create the difference between the temperatures in that region can then be mapped onto a global map, and you can come up with an observational estimate effectively of what would have happened in that grid cell had you deforested, at least from a skin temperature point of view. So it's a space for change method. So it's like an observational constraint, or at least an attempt to have an observational constraint. And you can see you can define it not everywhere. You need to have, grid cells that have both forest and grassland. And I think there's various other criteria, the problems in the deep tropics with cloud cover and things like that, that obfuscate things. But that's a sort of an observational estimate. Then you can say, okay, let's compare to what happens if you do, in this case, a global deforestation experiment in a coupled model, in this case, CSM, and compare that. What you see is a very little, a lack of agreement between this observational estimate of the skin temperature change based on the space for change method compared to what you're seeing in the coupled model. I should say this is the deforest minus control. That's one of the little bits that was lost during my presentation crash. And so this is deforest minus control. So you say in a lot of places around the world, deforestation appears to be leading to cooling, whereas the observations suggest that it probably should be warming. Okay. And then you can also look at, we have the same simulation, exactly the same simulation with land-only simulation. So in this case, looking at deforest minus control, and what you see is that in the land-only configuration, the model actually agrees relatively well, at least in a qualitative sense, with the observational estimate. So that's interesting. Why is there such a difference between the land-only and the coupled? And the reason we believe is, and what they show in this paper, is that in the land-only mode, you're guaranteeing that because it's forced with observations, that it's experiencing exactly the same climate. Whereas in the coupled model, there is the opportunity for the model to respond, for the atmosphere to respond to the land use change, forcing and produce a response that may or may not look like the observations. So you can kind of confirm that this is maybe what's happening by looking at subgrid information. So as for example, this is what subgrid tiling might look like in a single grid cell in the model. And you might have a group of area that's trees and a group of area that's grasses. And if you look within the coupled simulation and compare those two, this is the picture you get. So it's interesting, it actually looks very similar to the land-only simulation. And that is because in any individual grid cell, the forcing is identical for that grid cell. So it's whether it's warm or cold or whatever from the deforestation, in that deforested simulation on its own, it's getting exactly the same forcing. So this is kind of nice because it's indicating that maybe what this means is that the model is actually, from the land perspective, is simulating the impact of land use change correctly, and that the reason you get a differing response in the coupled model is because of feedbacks. And then finally, by using this technique, you can then look at the trees in the deforested simulation compared to the trees that are remaining in a grid cell in the control simulation, and that is the feedback response in that part of the world. So this is nice because now within LUMIP, we have these land use change experiments. And for the first time, we have these experiments for both coupled and land-only simulations with exactly the same model. So on the left here is the all forcing simulation, and the right here is the no land use and land cover change simulation that we have requested as tier 1 simulations for both coupled and uncoupled. So then this allows for a multi-model exploration of LUMIP. And you combine this with the availability of these couplet and land-only simulations with the fact that we have asking for subgrid land use data, we can now ask this question: are the models, is that response that we're seeing in CSM robust? Are all the land models doing a decent job of simulating the skin temperature impact of land use change? And then if that was true, for example, we could then isolate the differing responses to the different atmospheric feedbacks. And while that will still be an uncertainty, we can at least understand where that uncertainty is coming from. Okay, moving on to these alternative land use scenarios for the projection periods. In them, if we intentionally focused on SSP1 2.6 and SSP 3-7, the reason we did that is because SSP1 2.6 is the so-called sustainability SSP, quote unquote, taking the green road, where there are low challenges to mitigation and adaptation. And in this scenario, which is the solid lines on the figure, we can see that there's crop areas increasing to meet food demands, but at the same time, there's an effort to do afforestation to reduce as a carbon capture and storage mechanism. And we're comparing that to the SSP 3-7, which is the regional rivalry SSP, quote unquote, a rocky road, where there are high challenges to mitigation and adaptation. And in that scenario, to meet the food demands of the growing population, there's a lot of deforestation that's going on, that's being replaced by croplands. And there's very little effort to come up with any sort of mitigation strategy to help mitigate against the carbon emissions by replanting forests. And so one of the papers that is already been submitted is trying to look at the impact of these different scenarios on soil carbon sequestration and asking questions about what the implications for the 4 per mil initiative, which is one of the ways that within the Paris Agreement that we're going to try to get to low CO2 concentrations, is to find ways to increase the storage of soil carbon on land. And the 4 per mil is saying we need like a 4% increase, I believe, soil carbon on land to try to help mitigate. So what we're finding, and this is, I think, really the first time people have really looked at this in any detail, is that perhaps not surprisingly, the models are not agreeing on the implications of the alternative land use land cover change trajectories in terms of soil carbon. The upper plot's a little bit busy and a little bit hard to read, so maybe let's focus on the table on the bottom left. And the table is showing that, if you look at the one on the right here, this is where we have in SSP3, comparing the simulation, we have the SSP 3-7 with SSP 126 land use compared to the standard SSP 3-7. And so what you expect here is ideally there'll be carbon, there's afforestation or reduced deforestation between those two experiments. And you might expect that would lead to an increase in carbon storage in the soils on land. Well, what you can see is that out of the 6 models that are included here, really only 3 of them show an increase in storage, 2 of them show a decrease, and 1 of them shows no change. So there's a weak indication that afforestation in these models at least could drive a soil carbon increase, but really the models are not agreeing very widely. So this is a challenge for this 4 per mil initiative. Just to understand why these models, why are you getting in UK ESM a loss of soil carbon, or in GFT a loss of soil carbon when you're deforesting? Sorry, when you're afforesting. The other thing we're trying to do with these mitigation scenarios is trying to store carbon in plants. And so one thing, the big question that's always been out there is that do integrated assessment models and ESMs agree on the carbon consequences of alternative future land use and land cover change scenarios? And so our experimental design doesn't allow you to easily ask the question, what's happening in SSP 1 alone? Like, is the model accumulating the right amount of carbon in SSP 1? But it does allow you to compare what's happening between SSP 1 and SSP 3-7. And so Kate provides information that says that in the image is expecting 27 petagram increase in carbon due to land use change, compared to SSP3-7, which is expecting a 98 petagram loss of above ground carbon or plant carbon due to the deforestation. So the difference between these two scenarios is 125 petagrams of carbon. So the question is, can models replicate that? And what we're finding is, so far we've just looked at CSM2, but we want to look at this in multi-model sense. There's a couple of things. One, this plot's a little bit hard to see because the lines just by coincidence happen to line up on top of each other. But this dashed green line is the SSP126 simulation with SSP126 land use. And so you see an increase in carbon storage as you expect due to CO2 fertilization and the contribution from afforestation. Coincidentally, this red line here is the SSP, or purple line is SSP3-7 simulation with SSP3-7 land use. And that actually has the same amount of carbon accumulated, even though the CO2 trajectory is much different, right? It's much higher CO2, there's higher CO2 fertilization. Then if you compare the green dashed line with the purple dashed line, that's the impact of the difference in the land use trajectories. And you can see at that CO2 level, SSP126 CO2 level, there's an increase in the accumulated carbon of 116 petagrams of carbon. So that compares pretty favorably with that 125 petagrams of carbon that they were expecting. And just wanted to make this point here is that, you know, this assessment is a little bit challenging because if at a higher CO2 concentration, that afforestation would have a stronger impact effectively, or the lack of deforestation would have a stronger impact. And you would actually gain 143 petagrams of carbon at a higher CO2 concentration. So broadly, the news is good from this one model at least. The model is broadly consistent with the IM expectations. The question is, what are other models doing? And we want to look into more detail also to say, where is the IM expecting carbon to be accumulated? And is that where the carbon is actually getting accumulated? There's obviously the chance that the IM is asking for afforestation in a part of the world where, you know, the model CSM or another model might not be able to support vegetation growth. But from the global perspective, this is indicating that is good news. And then finally, the last little mini topic is on the land management factorial. And here I'm actually going to start with this, maybe a little bit strangely at first, but it'll become clear in a moment, with this topic of the trends and the amplitude of the CO2 annual cycle. And so, you know, we're all aware that CO2 is increasing. That's obvious. And probably most of you are also aware that there's been an increase in the annual amplitude of the seasonal cycle. And so it's been kind of potentially problematic for a lot of models to sort of be able to capture that increase of the CO2 amplitude. And if you don't capture that increase, then you have to question a little bit the fidelity of your model. And so just showing on the left here is what I'm talking about, the seasonal cycle amplitude. And then the right here is I should have put the reference. This is, I can't remember which paper this is coming from, but showing that there's been an increase over time in the amplitude of the annual cycle at many sites, in this case, Monterey. And again, I'm going to be focusing on CSM to start because that's the model we have access to in the CLM simulations. But what we know is kind of interesting is that the amplitude of the annual cycle was weak in CSM1 and showed weaker growth than observed. So that's the red here. I don't have observations on here, but the observations are pretty similar to what CSM2 looks like. So it was too weak, the annual cycle amplitude. In this case, this is a global northern hemisphere average. And also the growth wasn't as strong, was quite weak. Both of these features have been improved in CSM2. And so one question we're asking here at NCAR is, you know, why? What led to that increase? And there's probably several reasons. But one thing we do know, it's new in CSM2, significantly different in CSM2 compared to CSM1, is that we now include managed crops, planting, harvesting, fertilizing, and irrigating. And that there's, you know, the model as including, based on the land use harmonization data set 2, trends in fertilization and irrigation. So to try to like tease out what's going on about what the source of that increase in trend in the CO2 amplitude is, we've been relying on the land-only land management experiments that are part of LUMIT. And so this is the set of experiments that we have designed for LUMIT. They're all land only. They all go from 1850 to present day. And there's all these simulations with one at a time modification of a particular aspect of land management, or in some cases, climate or CO2. And so the core experiment is the land historical management. That's the simulation that everybody would do. You just take your model as is with all its bells and whistles or lack of bells and whistles, whatever it is. And that's your default simulation. And then as your model's ability is, you change certain things. So in this case, we were asking a question about what happens if you start in the year 1700 instead of 1850. What happens if you turn off no land use line cover change? That's obviously the big hammer. A question about alternate land use histories, trying to get a range of different possible land use trajectories, and what impact does that have? And then things focused on land management, like turn off shifting cultivation, or switch from an active crop model, if you have one, to crop and pasture as an unmanaged grassland. Or turning off irrigation and fertilization, if you have a crop model, turning off irrigation on its own, fertilization on its own, wood harvest, pastureland, fire, etc. So all different aspects of land management. And again, this was specifically designed so that any model could participate, whether or not you're simulating all these things. You just do these simulations that are appropriate for your model. And then finally, 2 simulations to help provide context with the constant CO2 simulation and the constant climate simulation. So in this case, we're looking at these 6 or 7 different simulations to try to understand what's happening in terms of the trends in the CO2 amplitude. Okay, so what we're doing is focusing initially on the managed crop simulation compared to this crops as grassland. So the managed crop, we're planting, harvesting, irrigating, fertilizing, and then crop as grassland. The crops function as a standard C3 grass. The first thing we see is that the purple here is the managed crops. The amplitude of the annual cycle, globally averaged, is larger than when you're doing crops as grassland. And that's for several different reasons. One, crops are more productive due to the specific parameter values. In addition, they're being irrigated and fertilized. Then on the right here, we can look at the trends in the NVP amplitude, which is roughly equivalent to the trends in the CO2 amplitude, or at least analogous. And the green line shows the crops as grasses. So there's an increase, but when you turn on the crops with management, you see a very large increase. In fact, it's actually a factor of 2 bigger when you have the active crops compared to the generic crops. And so then if you sort of use these land management simulations, you can say, let's turn off irrigation, or let's turn off fertilization and see what happens. And turning off irrigation didn't have much impact on the growth of the NVP amplitude, because really there's not that much of the world that's irrigated. But the fertilizer had a really strong impact. If you turn off fertilization, you lose a lot of that change. And then if you go back and look, and I'm not going to show this result here, but you can try to figure out where is the trend coming from, with just the generic crops. And that's coming, not surprisingly, from an increase in CO2 and the CO2 fertilization associated with that, and also a change in climate, mostly in the high latitudes where the Arctic growing season is getting longer. So here's the way where these land management experiments have allowed us to tease out sort of an emergent property of the system, where it's coming from. So that's it. In summary, of all those things are kind of incomplete stories still at this point, but I wanted to give you a flavor of the things we're looking at. There's a lot of limit simulations available, and they're increasingly becoming available. And planned analyses are underway and are beginning to yield some new scientific insight. If you're interested in participating, please either contact the paper lead or register your own interest for a topic that's not yet planned, or contact me if you want me to help facilitate any of these things.